Economic growth is often presumed as a development virtue because of the presumption that more wealth creation is needed to address poverty and population growth. Yet the public is seldom informed what such growth entails. All we are told is that growth suggests more production in the economy and hence more prosperity. However, we have seen that jobless growth is also very real in today's world and continues to bedevil policymakers. Furthermore, growth is often concentrated among the wealthy and may not always trickle down to those who most need it. In biological systems, growth is always considered an intermediate step towards stability. Living things grow during certain stages of development and then reach maturity. Indeed, unfettered growth in natural systems is considered a disease. The pathology of cancer cells stems from their uncontrolled growth. However, in the mantra of modern economics, it is assumed that growth is essential for well-being. Economists have successfully branded themselves as scientists with mathematical exactitude who can negotiate the vagaries of human consumption patterns through pricing mechanisms. Yet the life support systems that sustain the planet have eluded their grasp. Given the resistance of conventional economics to consider environmental constraints directly, a parallel field of ecological economics had to develop, led by a few rebel researchers. Most notable among them was Romanian-American economist Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who had been a protégé of the great economist Joseph Schumpeter at Harvard. Georgescu-Roegen dared to embrace other physical sciences such as physics and biology in his analysis of the economy as part of a complex ecological system. His seminal book, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, published in 1971, was the first treatise to consider physical constraints on capitalism, described by his mentor Schumpeter as a process of creative destruction. Subsequently, his work was also developed by a few strident and visionary professionals, such as former World Bank executive Herman Daly, who suggested that steady-state economics was eventually needed to ensure environmental sustainability. Despite the continuing snub from the Nobel Academy to such ecological economists, there seems to be a promising shift across the tectonic plates of economic thought that just might close the fault lines. Recognition of resource policy scholar Elinor Ostrom as a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 suggested a tentative interest by the Nobel Academy in considering alternative approaches to the economic growth paradigm. At the same time, ecological economists have moved closer to the pricing strategies that have been the pulse of conventional economic analysis. For example, to conserve a wetland, they are now making the case for how the ecosystem provides an economic service of preventing property damage from hurricanes or naturally cleaning effluent. As an example, New York City made this estimate directly many years ago when it chose to conserve the Catskills watershed. Independent estimates showed that the total cost of building and operating the filtration system to serve the same purpose would be $6 to $8 billion. Conventional economists are also beginning to think outside their hallowed box and consider the consequences of neglecting ecological constraints. Chinese economists estimated in 2011 that neglecting environmental factors had cost them 13% of their gross domestic product. However, economic growth still remains sacrosanct to mainstream economists. While there is little doubt that economic growth is necessary for developing countries to climb out of poverty, what is less clear is the necessity for economic growth in mature economies where population is also stabilizing. A troika of inertial forces has prevented our move forward in addressing this issue. The first part of the challenge is the persistent and often errant conflation of technological innovation with economic growth. Innovation is a cause rather than a consequence of growth. Second is the questionable assumption that links economic growth to quality of life that has been challenged among others by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. Third, there is an incipient reluctance for the global economic system to grapple with the question of inequality of wealth because of the political stigma of socialism. On the issue of inequality, environmental sustainability advocates also have a checkered record since they often advocate local insularity, even though international trade is well established as the most potent antidote to global inequality. If there is a nefarious necessity in this whole debate, it is perhaps the spectre of regulation. The common good of planetary protection will have a political price that pits proponents of individual liberty against the regulators. Yet in this day and age, many of the erstwhile proponents of individual choice on the conservative edge of the political spectrum have been all too willing to dispense with the individual liberties at the altar of security. Economics is essentially a science of managing resource scarcity. As we know all too well, natural resources and human populations are unevenly distributed across the planet. Global trade has allowed for some exchange, but for many people who are living in the most desperate of conditions, technological change has also played an important role. The rapid rise in agricultural productivity in the mid-20th century is often referred to as the Green Revolution, and Norman Borlaug was the leading pioneer who made this possible. A Nobel Peace Prize laureate, he used his agronomic training as a seed breeder to develop high-yield seed varieties for wheat in Mexico in the 1940s and the 50s. His subsequent collaborations with agronomist M.S. Swaminathan in India eventually led to successful replication of the techniques that were originally developed in Mexico. However, this progress, similar to the economic tunnel vision on economic growth, also led to discounting of many ecological concerns such as heavy fertilizer and pesticide usage. So how do we consider such progress trajectories analytically? The Russian-American economist Simon Kuznets considered human development trajectories and their connection to inequality and suggested that there was parabolic relationships between the two. As countries become richer, they initially become more unequal since wealth is generated by the high-risk, high-reward entrepreneurs. Over time, the wealth leads to more sustained development across society. The rising tide, proverbially, lifting all ships. A similar trajectory has been suggested by some economists in terms of environmental harm, getting worse initially along a development path due to a rush to develop and then slowly diminishing as communities realize the need to regulate pollution. Such a trend happened to some degree for inequality and environmental harm, but it can be argued that the curve can be reversed as people begin to exploit systems or other ecological pressures increase. Furthermore, there could be some irrevocable limits or carrying capacities for environmental systems that are exceeded, and we have irreversible impacts such as the extinction of species. Perhaps it is time to consider ecological security as the lens through which we approach economic regulations as well, since ultimate resources are always predicated on ecological systems. Such an approach would require regulating the scale of consumption in developed countries, while creating incentives for constructive consumption and trade in developing countries for poverty alleviation. We need to use measures of economic performance of countries, not just in terms of economic indicators or even human development indicators, but also environmental indicators. Thus, country decision makers should note indices such as the Yale Environmental Performance Index that ranks countries by their environmental performance alongside conventional United Nations indices such as the Human Development Index. It is high time we have a more nuanced and naturalized approach to economic growth that acknowledges the resilience as well as the constraints of natural systems.